This webinar has been organized by Journalism Fund, and it is the 4th webinar we have carried out in the framework of our Modern Slavery Unveiled training program. I would like to thank all those people who have been following and attending our webinars so far. I would also like to invite journalists connected today to apply for our next call for grants for Modern Slavery Unveiled grant program. The deadline is on Thursday, 15 September 2022. And if you have any doubts or questions about your application, we have some pre-application sessions on the 5th and 6th of July. So please, you can book your spot to have this pre-application session with us, and we can help you to have a successful application. Cross-border teams of professional journalists can apply for a grant to cover working time and or expenses to investigate, document, and expose aspects and cases of forced labor, cross-continental trafficking, and other issues related to the exploitation of Asian victims in Europe. Before we begin, I have a few housekeeping notes. Today's session is being recorded to be available for viewing post-session. However, for the security of our second speaker, the survivor, we won't publish her intervention. If you have any questions for the presenters, please use the chat feature in this Zoom webinar. Each presenter today will have around 30 minutes for their presentations. If one of our presenters completes their presentation before their 30 minutes, there might be some time for a question from attendees. However, we will hold most questions until the end of the session, and I will then read questions out loud for the presenters to answer as time permits. Today, we'll be discussing how to conduct interviews that minimize re-traumatization and yield evidence of the victim's experience of the crime. It will also approach other strategies to effectively interview victims of trauma, such as building rapport as the first step when getting in touch with victims. We will be featuring Sanne Terlingen from Lost in Europe, and a survivor of modern slavery who has been contacted with the help of the organization Survivor Alliance. So we would like to thank Survivor Alliance for their assistance managing this webinar, but especially to get in touch with this person. We will also like to inform you that at the end of the questions and answers, we will share with you a QR code that will direct you to a survey, and we will send you the link via the chat as well. But this is not mandatory, but it will help us organize more trainings that can encourage more investigations in the framework of modern slavery. Having said this, we would also like to know from where you are following this webinar. So right now we are sharing a question on your screen, and you can tell us from which region of the world you are connecting to. So my colleague Marie now will share a poll with all of you. So I would like to see from where you are following this webinar. It's very important for us to know from which region of the world you are connecting, because this also helps us to know what kind of topics we can also organize in this kind of training program. So it's for us always an honor to receive journalists from different countries of the world, because this also shows that the interest in modern slavery, human trafficking, it's an important topic that we need to address in investigative journalism. So we give you some minutes to do it. Thank you for your comments on the chat. I see people from the Middle East. Thank you for being here. Okay, maybe Marie, we can end the poll and we will see. Okay, we have people from Asia. We have people from Africa. Thank you. Also, a lot of people from Western Europe, Southern Europe, Northern Europe, Eastern Europe. Thank you. People from North America, people also from South and Central America. So thank you. Thank you for being here. It's for us always an encouragement to know from which countries you are following these kind of trainings, because we will also like to organize more sessions like this one. So today we will start with Sanne Terlingen, who will be speaking about trauma interview techniques and about examples of human approach with survivors. She is an investigative reporter currently working for Lost in Europe, and previously for Argos, the main investigative radio program in the Netherlands. She primarily reports on migration, trafficking, child sexual abuse, and organized crime. So now it's the moment where Sanne will share with us her experience and especially useful information for journalists investigating human trafficking. Thank you, Sanne, for being here. The floor is yours.
Thank you for inviting me. I start with sharing my screen. Let's see to show you all my presentation, because that makes it a bit easier. Let me first introduce myself. My name is Sanne Terlingen. Paola already told you that I'm working for Lost in Europe. It's a cross-border network, and we try to figure out what happened to thousands of migrant children who disappeared after arriving in Europe. So we made some stories about Vietnamese teenagers who disappeared from a protected shelter in the Netherlands and ended up dead in a lorry that was found in Essex. We made stories about Nigerian pregnant women who disappeared from the shelters, and even how thousands of Nigerian people disappeared from the asylum center in 1 year. But also stories on Eritrean refugees who ended up living on the streets due to faults in our asylum system and then were vulnerable to trafficking. So these stories covered actually three types of trafficking or smuggling and abuse situations, because the Vietnamese children, if they disappear, they mostly end up being found on cannabis farms or working in nail bars. The Nigerian girls are forced to commit sex work, and the Eritreans, they are quite vulnerable for all kinds of situations and sometimes used for drugs trafficking by gangs under pressure to pay debts or for their survival. With Argos, I worked on a very large story about child sexual violence, organized child sexual violence, and we worked with over 100 survivors. And I mostly use examples from that investigation, since we work with so many people, and they were all survivors of trafficking and early childhood trafficking. So it relates the most to the topic that we are talking about today. When I started as a journalist, there were no lessons in school about trauma. The stories about women who had been raped or who had been forced to do sex work were mostly published in women's magazines as survivor stories, but they were not part of the news desk or of investigative journalism. And actually, I was a bit picky about it as well. I thought that the side of the perpetrator was far more interesting. I thought then you have the story of what drives someone to commit a crime, and the survivor is just a survivor, someone that something happened to, and it might have been another person as well. So why are these stories so interesting? Later on, I actually learned that the survivors are actually witnesses of things that we are very, very interested in as journalists: organized crime, migration issues, trafficking, war. And they're actually the witnesses when there are no documents available, no other material. So that is very, very useful if we learn how to work with these people and do it in a proper way. So let me first start with the idea, what is trauma? So what is the effects of their experience on how they are willing to articulate their story? And a trauma is literally a wound, a psychological injury. And this means actually that the person who is traumatized is someone who has experienced something very bad and is damaged as a result. And when you are in a very, very heavy situation, like a car accident, or when you're attacked, or when you're raped, it's so overwhelming that your normal coping mechanism stops. And you enter the fight, flight, freeze mode, for example. This is when your body is really, really active. It's a hyperarousal. So you want to flee, and if that doesn't work, you fight or scream for help. But this also affects your body. So you increase your heart rate, your pupils get wide open. It helps you to focus. You don't go to the toilet. But it also means that how you focus is different than in a normal situation. So people who have been in this situation usually remember some details very specifically, and other details they can't see. So they might know someone's shoes, but they can't remember someone's face, or they don't know how long the situation lasted. And this is actually when you're not able to flee, you will probably freeze or fawn or faint. And this actually happens when a situation takes very long, because your body just, you don't survive. If you're, for example, your child, you can fight all the time, you just freeze, or you get out of the situation. And this is actually called dissociation, and it happens when the pain or fear is too much. And this is actually when your body starts to give some, you're taken out of the situation, so you feel less pain, you're not feeling your body, you're feeling less emotions. And this is also a survival mechanism, but it also influences the memory of the situation, that someone doesn't remember all the details that were there. And at the moment of the trauma, these are survival mechanisms, but when returning to normal life, they can get in the way. So they can be PTSD, or so someone gets back to the fear as soon as they're remembered of the situation, or their reaction turn inward when they're dissociating. They blame themselves, they distance themselves from the situation, so they're not able to talk about their emotions or to feel their emotions when you're talking to them. And I'm telling all of this because it affects how your sources respond when you interview them. So that's why I give you this basic knowledge, because you take them back to the situation, and they will automatically respond in a way that they responded at that time, even especially when they didn't have any trauma therapy for the situation. And that means that you have to create a safe environment for them to bring them back. So someone, because in most situations, someone has felt really powerless. That's actually the cause of the trauma. So you want to create a situation where they don't feel powerless, but give them the idea that, hey, they have control over the interview. And that also means that you just cannot go with them and pick a quote and publish it in your story. That's not going to work. Okay, then how are you going to start the interview? You first need to know, why do you really want to talk to this person? So in short, what do you need for your story or for your research? Do you need some atmosphere for someone, or do you need evidence, or do you want to have someone to just explain what it was like that it happened so others can relate? Make sure that you have that very clear for yourself, so you do not unnecessarily start stirring someone's deepest traumas, and you don't need to use it. And be honest about your goals to the other person. So you explain what you want from someone, and it might even be that you don't know it. If you just approach someone and you don't know what he or she has to tell, you can also be honest and say that you're just interested to know more and see if you can work together, and what he or she is interested to share with you. Or you can just, I don't know what my research will reveal, but may I meet you? The other thing is, why would this person want to talk to you? Because why would someone want to reveal their biggest trauma to the public? I wouldn't do that. I want to keep that close, and especially not tell it to a stranger who shares it with the world. What I learned from most people is that they usually contribute because they want to improve something for others. It's not because they want to blame someone or that they want to attack someone or that they want the attention. They want to improve something. And this might be the understanding of certain taboos or showing to other survivors that there is a way out. In the case of human trafficking, hoping that others will be saved if the story is taken seriously. And especially when it comes to this point, you have to be very honest to them, what you can deliver and what you can't deliver. So when I work with refugees and migrants, I met a lot of children and or undocumented people who wish that they would get asylum, and they think that when I publish their story, it might help them to get asylum. I'm very honest with them from the beginning. My story is not going to help you to get asylum, and it's really, really important to be honest about that, or that it's not going to make sure that the perpetrator is going to get arrested, or that others are going to be saved, because otherwise the person might have that as the reason to talk to you. And if you don't deliver that result, he or she might even feel betrayed by you. What I do see is that not all journalists are dishonest to their sources about this, because they're afraid that someone moves away, that if they're dishonest, I cannot deliver this and I cannot deliver that, and you should not expect this from me. They are afraid that the source then draws out of the interview and doesn't want to share the story. But my experience is actually that if you do it this way, you really get someone's full consent. And if someone gives the consent to you, knowing what it will be like that you're going to work on the story together, your bonding is stronger and you move much further together. And otherwise, someone might draw back from the investigation even later on. Then during the preparation, when you have someone on board, really think where you're going to meet someone, about the setting. So do you want to do they want to do the interview face-to-face? Is it better to use the phone or email? I always thought that you should do a personal interview face-to-face. But it's actually not the case. It might feel really intense for someone. So I had some survivors who felt that they had no control when I was in their personal space, and they actually want to share their story via email first, or answer the difficult questions via email, and do other things face to face. So just ask them in what way they like to talk to you. And also important to know is that a video or FaceTime can be a trigger when it comes to victims who have worked, for example, who have been abused, forced to do webcam sex, or have been filmed during sexual abuse. They don't like to be interviewed via Zoom or Teams. So always ask someone how he or she would like to be interviewed. Also ask about the location where you want it to take place, because some people want to be interviewed in their house because their house feels as the safest place and they are at home as soon as the interview ended, which means they can relax and they don't have to travel anymore. Other people don't want to be interviewed in their houses because they don't want to bring the heavy story to their safe space. So they actually prefer to tell it somewhere else. And it's actually the same with the person present. Some people want their best friend being present because he or she is safe, or their parent present, and others don't want their friends to know the terrible details of what happened to them and rather tell their story alone or have their therapist with them. So always ask them about the location, about who's there, and discuss this over and over again, because the preference differ, but it gives them a lot of control if they can create a setting that feels safe for them. I always do these interviews with a colleague because they're also quite heavy for me, and it helps for me if someone is there who know what it was like, and you get a bit more of an informal setting if my colleague and I can talk to each other, or he can switch the topic if I'm digging too much. So doing these kind of interviews with a colleague makes the situation often more easy than doing it one-on-one. The other thing is dare to jettison your plans. I give the example of a girl who really wanted to talk, and but she was so scared that she literally didn't get a word said. So we decided not to interview her, but just give her a coffee, talk about other interviews we did, how we did that, and didn't put any pressure on her. And she was with us for 2 hours, and I didn't get any word of the interview, but because we treated her that way, she came back later on and exactly delivered the information that we were looking for. So sometimes it's good really not to push and just to respect someone's boundaries, and you will get some reward for that, or not, but most of the time you're rewarded. During the interview, again, give the person control. So again, explain the setting, because you're going to take someone back to a period of fear, to their most vulnerable moments, which feels like danger. So you have to get someone there as safely as possible. And why I explain everything to them. One survivor explained it really clearly to me. She said, when I was in a child abuse network, I was tied to the bed, waiting while cars drove over the gravel, and I heard that, and I was waiting for something bad to happen, but having no control over it. And she actually explained that the fact that journalists explain what's exactly going to happen. So we're going to take this step, and it's good. The interview might last 2 hours, and I want to pick this and this and this topic, and this is why we want to do it this way. Would that be okay for you? That it really helps them to realize that they are not in that situation of waiting for something bad to happen, but they are actually the ones who control what's going to happen. I also explain them what I will do with the answers. So I always explain them that I'm not immediately going to publish something, or how I am going to store information, or if I recheck with them before I publish something. So we also have an agreement about that, so they feel safe about what they are sharing with me and what they are not going to share with me. When I've written down the word cup of tea. That's not literally a cup of tea, but when you take someone back to the trauma, someone really feels back in the moment. And as I already explained to you, this also brings back the symptoms of PTSD and dissociation. So you want to make sure that their body realize that it's now and that the trauma is then. And what helps for that, if you touch their senses. So if you give someone a cup of tea in their hands, they feel warm tea, and they have to connect with their hands to this cup of tea, which makes that part of them, part of their body, shows really that they're in the presence. You can also open the window, so they hear some noise from the outside, they feel some fresh air. If they really start to dissociate, you can play music or have someone they know really well talking to them, but you play with their senses to make sure that they don't go fully back to the moment of fear when you're talking about the worst part of their experiences. When someone panics and it's quite clear, but when someone dissociates, you don't often see it, because that's when someone disconnects from the body. So what you can see is that someone starts staring or stumbling or asking if you can repeat the question, yawning, so rubbing their eyes. So it's actually their body is slowing down. And that are all symptoms of dissociation. And when you see this happening during the interview, this might mean that your interviewee had too much and that you have to pause a little bit, because otherwise the fear will come after the interview. So if you see that something like this happens to your interviewee, you have to check after the interview if there's someone with them, if they're okay, because it probably all comes back to them as soon as you're gone. It might happen that you make someone cry. Just let them cry. It's okay if they're crying. At first, I didn't know if I was allowed to touch someone, because a lot of survivors are I thought that people have touched them without them wanting to, so I didn't want to be in their personal space by just holding them. But actually, one survivor told me that she felt even worse when people didn't do that to her. She felt like that she was not even worth it to be comforted. So she wanted the journalist to ask, can I put an arm around you? Or can I just hold your hand? Or do you want to pause? Because if the journalist doesn't do that, she feels even more alone and worthless and not treated as a person. Watch your language. Be aware of the fact your words can have. I find this quite difficult to do in English because I'm used to work in Dutch. But for example, the word abuse and rape and sexual violence all have a different connotation. Sometimes I meet victims or survivors who prefer the word abuse because it's less heavy for them to talk about abuse than rape. But on the other hand, when they have been in a network that uses violence against them for years and years, abuse sounds very small for what happened in a final publication. And it's the same with the word victim or survivor. Survivor shows someone's strength and that someone is more than just a victim, but someone is still in a network. So he or she is a victim at the time of writing. So I always try to reflect during the interview what kind of language the interviewee uses, and I give the same words back to them, or I ask them which words they would prefer in the final publication, or I explain why I use certain words. During the interview, don't end with the most intense moment, but with something that gives someone back the control over the here and now. So bring them back out of the situation of fear. Ask them what they would like to achieve in the future, who has helped him or her a lot. If necessary, ask for feedback. How did he or she think that the interview went? Is there something that they still like to add? Shortly, I go to the don'ts. Don't cross their boundaries again, because all the time, these people, they are used that people cross their boundaries. Sometimes they are not able to say no immediately because they're so common that people cross their boundaries all the time. So please don't push during the interview. If there's something you really, really need for your investigation, explain to them why you really want that answer, but leave it up to them if they can give it or not. Don't say, I understand how you feel, because you don't know. You don't have been in a trafficking network probably as a child for years and years and years. So if you say to them, I know how you feel, it makes them even feel more alone. Just ask if someone can explain what it feels like for them, and listen. Same with the question, why did you do that? Why sounds like blaming. It sounds like if they had any influence over a situation. So why have you given your child up for adoption? Why did you come to Europe? Why did you go with that smuggler? It makes them feel like they're to be blamed for what happened to them, as if it's their fault. That doesn't mean that you can ask questions about it, but ask them in a different way if you really want to know. So ask them for the moment that they decided to go with someone. What was the situation like? What were your thoughts at that time? And then you're not a rescuer, you're not a therapist. When you really care for someone, or you see that someone has been in a very unjust situation, you might feel like you want to help them. But they talk to you because you're a journalist, and they don't talk to you because you're a therapist or a friend. And when you start to switch roles, you also create uncertainty with them. So they don't know any longer what they can expect from you, which actually makes the situation unsafe for them. They lose control over the situation when you cross that line. So stay the journalists. And then now I talked a lot about interviewing, but research isn't just about how much someone likes working with you. You also have to be critical and check whether a testimonial is correct. And exactly, you have to do that even more with stories that revolve around testimonials. But the first thing I've written down is believing versus verifying. Sources can be very sensitive about this, especially when it comes to abuse or rape, or asking for asylum. They've often experienced that their stories are not being believed. So they can be greatly stressed by the question, what evidence do you have for that? Didn't you do it yourself? Is it really true? Do you have to win something from that? At the same time, my experience is that you can easily explain to most sources that you should check a story. They understand perfectly well that it's better if I question them critically than if all those questions are asked by strangers after a story is published. Or when I explain to them that if we mispublish one detail, people will stop believing the rest of the story. I tell them that it's not about believing or not believing, but when we publish something, we have to verify everything that's published, and otherwise we cannot publish it. And this will get you a long way if you say it that way. As I already told you, trauma affects memories. Some parts are very clear, too clear. Other parts are not so clear. There's no begin, no end. It's all threads. One of my sources said this, it's like looking at something through a microscope, focused on a detail, and the rest you can get to. You cannot zoom out, only after a lot of therapy. And this makes it very difficult to get the evidence. So what can you ask, or what's provable if you want to get evidence? But because of course, as a journalist, you want to know everything. You want to know what it was like, what they went through. But when I did some research into the organized child abuse, I found some overlap between perpetrators mentioned. And then I show you an example of what you shouldn't do. One of my male colleagues, he actually advised me to check a story, to verify a story, by asking to a survivor if she could tell what the penis of a specific person looked like. So I did what this colleague said to me, and that women told me, Sanne, I've literally seen hundreds. One thing I try not to pay attention to, it was that. So it's exactly the detail that you shouldn't ask me about, because I didn't want to look at that. It's not what I remember. And besides, if I remembered, how are you going to check that my memory is correct? Are you going to ask a guy to drop his pants or something? And the same often applies to the details of traumatic events. It's probably not possible to verify how long a rape lasted, what someone did exactly during the rape. And if you ask a source these kind of questions about a traumatic event in a guiding way, you also might ruin a possible follow-up investigation if the case is brought to the police, because you already influenced how the survivor talked about the event. So when you're talking about rape, sexual violence, these kind of things, be very careful what you ask about a specific event. But what you can do is you can make a timeline, for example. So you can make a very specific timeline. How did the statement come about? When did someone start talking about it? To one, could the testimony be influenced? Are there inconsistencies? Then you can start looking for supporting evidence. And this can actually be anything, emails or messages sent after something happened, medical records when someone is wounded, therapy conversations from later on, notes, people in the area who've seen something, other witness statements that overlap. So there are a lot of ways to collect evidence about something that happened, but it's mostly about the setting that you can find things that you can verify, and not about the rape itself. It's often said, especially when it comes to trafficking or sexual violence, or child abuse, you have no video of it. And it's striking how often this happened in the event of abuse, but this is actually something that never happens when sources tell stories about a break-in in their home or frauds or whatever event. Then it's never said that you don't have a video about it, so your story is not true. No one asked for that video. So building up a very strong case with supporting evidence is usually enough. But it's something with sexual violence that editors and others and the police often say, you don't have a video from the direct event, we're not sure if you're going to believe you. Last thing, be careful not to ruin any evidence. For example, in one child abuse investigation, we searched through the computers, but we made a forensic copy of the computer, because otherwise, if the computers would have been brought to the police, then I was the last one who entered the computer, so they couldn't see for sure anymore if I changed anything in a computer, and then it would be no longer used in a police investigation. This is the last part that I want to walk you through, because with investigations related to trafficking or traumatized sources, you have to get closer to your source than you're used to. And what I learned is that it's often said by journalists that if you get close to a source, then you might be too involved, and this ruins your investigation. And this example that I want to show you is to show that building a relationship of trust with the source sometimes leads to more information that you can check, and thus to a more objective investigation than if you interview just both sides. It's the story of Marinka. Marinka was one of the 140 people that shared their story of organized child abuse with us. And one of the, I think, dozens of people at least, who were not anonymous. And there was overlap in the stories of Marinka and several other girls and some boys. And things were still happening to her. She received threat letters, phone calls, but she was not being believed. And one day in December 2019, Marinka got lost. And when she returned, she told that she was raped by several men, and they put shards of glass in her vagina. And at the time this happened, there was no sign that Marinka would become the main character in our story. She was one of the 20 victims that we worked with at that time, that we had regular contact with, and who shared their stories about the same locations and perpetrators. And when this happened to Marinke, she contacted me immediately, and she texted me in panic what happened. And then I asked her very practically, if you really have glass in your vagina, can I come with you if you have it removed? So I can verify for myself that this is really the case. In the end, the location was too far to be there on time, but she took a friend with her who made a video and this picture of the glass being removed. And the fact that this was possible was because Marinke and her friend had already knew that information was safe with me. Because otherwise, this is so personal, it's such a traumatizing moment. But they knew already that they could trust me, that if they would give something to me, it would be safe with me, that I wouldn't ask it if I didn't need it for evidence. So they did this and sent the video and the pictures to me. They also helped me to get the documentation from the hospital, and they asked the doctors to put the glass into a jar that I could send to a forensic lab for further investigation. And the forensic lab, they concluded that there was milk protein on the glass, suitable for holding of the glass by a man. So this was also a clear indication that she didn't put the glass in her vagina herself. If I had chosen for the approach of keeping distance from Marinke and approaching the man that she named as perpetrators, Marinke would not have given me this evidence, and the man would have told me that they didn't have anything to do with it. They would have told me that they didn't have anything to do with it if they didn't have anything to do with it. And they would have told me exactly the same if they were the perpetrators. So interviewing them wouldn't have given me any new evidence, while checking Marinke's story could give me far more details that I could verify that really something happened to her. And approaching the man might also have endangered Marinke, of course. And of course, we checked her story further. So we were allowed to check her phone, for example. So we could see that she had not been online during the time of the incident. We were allowed to interview her friend who saw her leave with someone. We interviewed another friend who saw her right after the incident, where she appeared 2 hours too late. And we saw in her phone that she had been during this time at a specific location in a specific warehouse. And because we also bonded with other survivors, we just, let's say the warehouse was in city X. So we asked other survivors that we knew who mentioned the same perpetrators. Do you know any locations of the network in this city? And they exactly came up with the same warehouse, describing the same color of the doors, describing the same entrance, the same location, building next to it. So we got all these details that made it a logical conclusion that the story of Marinke should be further investigated, instead of that it was being made up in therapy, as some people at the police told us. I don't give any further details about the story because of source protection, but I wanted to share it with you to show that being close to a survivor and giving them control and getting their trust doesn't mean that you cannot properly investigate a story and cannot go for truth finding. I've put 2 more slides here, but I don't go into that detail. You can find most of these experiences on the website of the DART Center. I'm going to show you the logo of the DART Center in the next slides. But of course, these kind of investigations do something to yourself as well. Here you do see what you have to look out for, that you have to be aware when you are experiencing these kind of symptoms. And then there are some things that you can do for self-care to stay sane yourself. Because if you get too involved, if you get traumatized yourself, it doesn't help anyone. It's quite easy to overwork yourself, because when you see so much trauma, you want to solve it. And working is also a mechanism to cope with it, because it makes you less powerless. And it's quite difficult to say, I need a night of Netflixing, when a lot of survivors are calling for your help, and you know that these things are happening in the outside world. But I would really advise you to take care of yourself, because if you're stable, you're a better journalist. And all this advice and how to stay sane, you can find it on the website of the Dart Center for Journalism and Trauma. They have a lot of tip sheets on how to help your colleagues if they're doing this kind of investigations, about alarm signals, and what you can do yourself when you're experiencing symptoms of secondary traumatization. Well, thank you for listening.
Thank you, Sanne. Thank you so much for your presentation. I'm sure everyone enjoyed, and we have some questions, but we will leave them for the end of the session. So now I will ask my colleague Marie to stop the live streaming on Facebook. As I told you, for the protection of our next speaker, the victim, we will, well, the survivor, sorry, we will not record this part of the session. So that's why, thank you for those who were watching us on Facebook. This is the end of the live streaming on Facebook, but the ones who enroll and register for the webinar can stay here in the session, and they will listen to the survivor. Thank you, Sanne. Thank you for your answers. Thank you for the presentation. The same for Jane. Thank you for sharing all your experiences. And I know, and I'm sure that all the journalists that were present here, and not only journalists, people in general, were taking into consideration all the information that was shared today. Thank you. And to close this webinar, I would also like to thank all the people that are here. And I would like to share with you some announcements that are important for you, especially if you are investigating human trafficking. The first information is about these Modern Slavery Unveiled pre-application sessions that we have on the 5th and 6th of July. So you can scan that QR code and you can enroll or register. You can book a spot there. It's half an hour meeting that we will have. You will do it with me, and I will give you more guidelines of how you have to structure your application. But I think that for these meetings or these pre-application sessions, we would like you to have already some proposals, some ideas that we can discuss together, and we can help you to maybe have a successful application. The next round for applications is on the 15th of September of 2022, sorry. So you have still some months left to apply, and in these pre-application sessions, we hope to help you to do it. The next announcement is, if you have been in this session, you can fill in the survey to let us know what were your impressions about this webinar, and also to suggest some other topics that we can address in the following webinars of the Modern Slavery Unveiled training program. And finally, I would also like to give you the website of our grants. You can scan that QR code to check the overview of grants of Journalism Fund. We have other different grants in environmental journalism, cross-border local journalism. Also, we have the grant of European cross-border grants, and we also have one grant that is for Flemish and Dutch journalists, that is the Fonds Pascal de Croos. So if you are interested, please don't hesitate to apply for our grants. You can scan that QR code. And also I will go back to the survey of today. If you are interested, please let us know what were your impressions of today's webinar. But with this, I would like to thank once again all the people who were connected today. And yes, thank you for the time. Thank you for for always connecting to this kind of sessions, and feel free to reach me out via email if you are interested or want to know more about our grants, and we can help you and give you some pre-application advice before our deadline in September. Thank you again, and have a nice afternoon, evening, morning, wherever you are. Bye.